RI9, Evaluating Claim and Evidence, revolves around determining whether or not information presented is effective and accurate. Of course, in many things in life, this is going to be crucial. I can think of voting for a big example. That's something you'll need to be very careful to evaluate. Make sure that the politicians that you decide to vote for are the best choice for the job. But in many other avenues of life too, you will need to determine whether or not people are being honest and fair with you before you make an important decision for your life. And looking at this particular target, we'll start at the 1 level. The 1 level says that you can identify the claim, evidence, details, and counterclaim in a text. The good news is you've already been doing this quite a bit, in particular with RI2, determining claim and evidence. So nothing new there at all. But at the 2 level, we start to add in some new. Not only can you identify the claim, evidence, and details, but you can also evaluate it or tell me how effective it is, but in a very limited fashion. You might only give me one observation, okay? So you might give me one example of why it is or is not effective. And that could relate to a couple of different things. Is the explanation clear? Are the details relevant and sufficient? Is there a counterclaim that is both acknowledged and responded to? At the 3 level, you can describe and evaluate, and you can do all of those things that I just mentioned. You can talk about the clarity of the piece, the relevancy and sufficiency of the details, and the acknowledgement and response to the counterclaim. At the 4 level, you can do all that in depth. So as always, we're going to consider this a close reading. You're going to give me specific details. Okay, so close reading with specific details to support your evaluation. AKA, you'll need to give me votes. Again, the first step of this particular target you've already done. You'll need to be able to tell me what the claim, evidence, and details are. But once you've done that, you're ready to move into the 2 level on up for RI2. And there are a couple of different topics to consider here. First, are the details relevant? What does this mean? Well, it means that they are on topic and that they are for the argument, of course with a possible exception of the counterclaim, but that should be very clearly identified as a counterclaim. Now when you are responding to this particular question, are the details relevant? A basic answer, you should be able to correctly identify whether they are or are not relevant. But if you want to push yourself, move up to that 4 level, you can actually give the claim in several details. Not all of them. You don't need to go crazy and write me the whole essay over again. And explain how they connect. That'd be a great way to earn yourself a 4. Okay. For are the details sufficient? Slightly different angle here, okay? Not just are they on topic, but are there enough of them? And are they well chosen for the audience? In other words, are they the right type of details to be included? And here you might specifically think back on the logos, ethos, pathos. Depending on the audience, you might see a bend toward a certain type of detail. For example, women, biologically, tend to be more in tune with their emotions. It's just fact. I mean, science has shown this. So you might see a piece that is targeted toward women featuring more pathos details in an effort to play on that. Whereas men might prefer to see maybe a little bit more logos and not want to hear about the emotion of the piece. So do consider the audience as you're doing that. When you're responding to the are the details sufficient question, you'll need to be clear as far as are there enough. You could in fact count the details and determine, well, is that an accurate number? If there's only 1 or 2 details, that may not be sufficient to prove the point. Okay? And then as far as that well-chosen piece, you'll need to discuss the audience and why the types of details are a good fit. Okay? Next up, we would consider the counterclaim. And of course, if you see a counterclaim there, you should ID it, and you should also explain how it's the counter. Because they're not always going to be the exact opposite of what's been written. Okay? Some of them might be a little bit more gray. And then, of course, identify, is it crushed? And it really should be. If it's not crushed, that is not an effective piece involving a counterclaim. Finally, we have the errors of reasoning. Are they there? And if they are, you should be able to explain why they are errors. Okay. Now, the errors of reasoning are a big enough topic that we're going to take a look at them on their own slide. So here we see a breakdown of the errors of reasoning. There are 4 main errors of reasoning, and this is what you'll need to give me. I don't need all the nitty-gritties except through explanation. You should be able to tell me whether or not faulty logic has been used in a text, whether or not an attack has been made in a text, whether or not a weak reference has been made, or whether or not there is misinformation in a text. Beyond that, you can simply explain. You don't need to have the exact terminology correct, but these are some examples that you could work with. Contradiction, falling under faulty logic, would be where the author actually contradicts themselves in their own writing. Perhaps they're trying to convince you that global warming is in fact a real issue, and then they mention something about it not being such a serious issue after all. The exception to the rule would be basically saying that one person's experience is true for all people, when we know that's certainly not going to be the case. As an example there. False cause, we've talked about before with text structures, saying that one thing led to another if it wasn't the only cause. An example here, saying your sports team won because the stadium was sold out. It might have helped, but it probably wasn't the only reason. Maybe they have really good players. No evidence given. There is no evidence or no details. That's not going to be a very effective piece, so do watch out for that. And then composition or division, saying that something is true for a small group must therefore apply to the whole group, or vice versa. We can't assume that things are an always or never situation. So if you see any always or nevers, probably not very effective. As far as attacks go, if you see someone arguing against a person rather than an idea, that would be considered an attack. So for instance, if a political candidate was just name-calling their rival, that would be an example of arguing against the person rather than actually talking about the topics that should be considered, what's actually at stake. Or appealing to force, if there's a threat in there, vote for me or else, or I am right, and if you believe something else, then you're going to be in big trouble. That'd be an example of appealing to force. For weak reference, you're looking for things like bias, so they don't have a counterclaim at all, or they only consider one point of view in a particular topic. Lack of credibility, referencing people who aren't actually experts in the subject. This would be basically if someone asked me as a teacher, what's your opinion on foreign policy? And then they published it as, this is the one true interpretation of foreign policy. Well, I don't really know that much about foreign policy, so I have a severe lack of credibility in that topic. Appealing to authority, saying that a person in power says so-and-so, so it must be true. Well, they're just one person, so it may not be true. We can't put all of our belief into a single individual. Appealing to the people, similar idea, saying that just because a lot of people believe it to be true, it must be true. Well, at one point in our time, or in our world, there was a time when all people believed the world was flat. We found out that wasn't true. So we can't trust the people all the time either. We're always learning new things as a species. And appealing to emotion would be using a sob story, basically, to try and convince people to believe a certain way. Now, you can use pathos details effectively, but you don't want to rely on that. So if you're going to use appealing to emotion as a weak reference, as an error of reasoning, then that would really be the only detail you'd see. If there are others to balance it out, it's really not that much of an error. Misinformation is pretty straightforward. They included information that was false. Okay, we're going to take a look at our sample piece here. Once again, Mark Twain's Corn-Pone Opinions. I'm not going to read through the whole thing, just as a reminder, if you've been checking out the other videos too. We know that this particular piece is about the problem of people not thinking for themselves. He gives details in list format. He gives a list of different groups of people who only believe what they believe because they were born into that particular group, political parties and religion being a forefront of his examples there. He also mentions that people only read the literature of their own political party. They don't take a look at the literature from other parties to see if there's any truth in their work as well. We trust our feelings too much, and then we also put too much trust in public opinion. All support for that there is no independent thought, that it's a very rare thing. Okay. So with that as our identified claim and the details are included, we're ready to start our evaluation. And the first question we will have for ourselves is, are these details relevant? Do they all relate to people not thinking for themselves? And the answer is yes. We've got groups of people thinking just because of how they were born, groups of people thinking just how they believe politically, people thinking just based on their feeling, and then people trusting public opinion. That's all relevant to the topic, and we could make a list of how they relate to the claim. As far as are they sufficient? Well, we certainly have many examples right here of different groups believing what they believe simply because they're born into it. So we've got quite a bit to work with there, and plus we really have 4 individual details overall, if you look here, and that's packed into one paragraph. So I would say for the size of this text, that is sufficient proof that people do not think for themselves. As far as, is it a good choice for the audience? Well, we talked about this a little bit before. Really this piece is about everyone not thinking for themselves, and as a whole, the text structure perhaps doesn't lend itself to meeting that purpose. A lot of people would not understand the elevated language that Twain uses here. But when we look just at the quality of the details, he is using groups of people that are easily recognizable in his logos detail. So we might say that's a good logos fact to include. People are familiar with political parties, only looking at their own beliefs. So again, I mean, that's a fairly good logos detail to use for the general population. Same thing with our feelings and with the public opinion relating to God. That's going to appeal to his audience. So as far as the details being sufficient from a content point, purely, they are. Is the counterclaim addressed and crushed? So here we're going to look for any sign that people might think independently, and he's got a pretty clear one here. Men think they think upon great political questions, and they do. So they are, in fact, thinking about important things. So he acknowledges it. We've got the counterclaim. Does he go on to crush it? Yes. But they think with their party, not independently. They read its literature, but not that of the other side, and they arrive at convictions that are drawn from a partial view of the matter in hand and are of no particular value. So he gives a very detailed crusher to his counterclaim, which he included. Now we're ready to consider the errors of reasoning. And when we take a look at this piece, there are 2 that come to mind for me. Faulty logic for one of them. You know, he identifies here several groups of people as being born into their beliefs and never questioning it. And I would really say that's composition/division under faulty logic. He's making a claim that all people who are Catholic or all people that are Baptist believe this simply because they were born into it. And I'm willing to bet that if you talked to a bunch of Catholics or a bunch of Baptists or a bunch of Mormons or a bunch of Republicans, that many of them have in fact thought through their beliefs and weren't simply born into it. So that could be an example of faulty logic. And then I would also say a little bit of weak reference here. He does have a counterclaim, but we're a little bit biased toward, a negative view toward both religion and politics here. Again, with this little bit of listing here, we're showing a real negative view toward those groups of people, and that may not be very appealing to some groups in his audience. Overall, is the text effective? Well, he certainly has enough information, and it is certainly specific, but we do have some errors of reasoning, and when we think too on the text structure, which we've already kind of talked about, and you're welcome to pull on here, overall, this piece probably would not have done much to get people to think more independently. Rather, it might have just offended them, in particular because of that faulty logic with the composition and division. If someone's going to tell you that you aren't really thinking for yourself because of who you are in terms of religion or politics, you're not likely to listen much more to them.